Bom dia, pessoal. Um prazer tê-los aqui. Sejam bem-vindos. Bem-vinda, Lan Tuivô. É um prazer também recebê-la. A Lan Tuivô tem no seu DNA profissional a excelente qualidade de ser uma boa contadora de histórias. Hoje ela usa, em grande parte do seu trabalho, os dados que estão na web. Mas nem sempre foi assim. Ela, no começo da carreira, era do time de jornalistas que costuma olhar para os dados e planilhas com certa desconfiança. Ela achava frios, impessoais. Até que em 2013 aconteceu uma coisa na vida dela que acontece com todos nós. Uma ruptura amorosa que aconteceu com ela quando ela era muito jovem. E ela percebeu uma coisa. Seja nas mensagens nas redes sociais, as músicas que ela ouvia nas plataformas, ela deixava pegadas digitais. E ela percebeu que poderia traçar uma linha do tempo de sua recuperação emocional juntando todos esses resíduos. Então ela percebeu, ela sacou que essas pegadas que a gente deixa, essas pegadas digitais que a gente deixa na web, ela conta uma história. E ela também descobriu que cada um de nós deixa pelo menos 5 gigabytes de dados na web. E todos esses dados contam histórias. A gente precisa fazer perguntas a eles. De forma autodidata, Lan Tuivô se tornou craque em programação, planilhas, códigos e análise de dados. E como uma escafandrista, foi atrás desses vestígios digitais, encontrou material valioso que a ajuda a contar histórias emocionantes, empáticas, complexas sobre pessoas, sociedades e o nosso tempo. A gente vai conversar com a Lan sobre desinformação, sobre inteligência artificial, mas eu acho que a melhor maneira de conhecê-la é através das boas histórias que ela conta. E em outubro desse ano, ela contou pelo Markup e foi reproduzida pelo Los Angeles Times uma excelente história. Uma história que se passa em Sun Valley, em Los Angeles. Uma história que envolve gigantes da tecnologia, uma história de medo e delírio, vigilância e punição que deixaria o Foucault de cabelo em pé. Lan Tuivô, você poderia contar passo a passo sobre essa história? Como surgiu a ideia, quais os dados que você levantou e como você os analisou e o que você descobriu a partir deles?
Good morning, everyone. So we are going to start with the most depressing thing I've done in the past few months, right? I'm a data reporter who's looked a lot at the systems that are built to surface information to us. It was very interesting to see a man from YouTube be the opener to this talk. And we should have a talk, wherever this young man is afterwards, to discuss the algorithms that surface information to us. But in October, I published a series about a company called Ring and Neighbors. Ring is a doorbell camera that people can buy to monitor the doorstep. You might have seen some of those in your own neighborhoods, but it's a company that is owned by Amazon, and it's been heavily marketed towards people to say, your packages are being stolen. You need to secure your home. Let's install a Ring camera. And in tandem with Ring cameras, you can also post video footage onto a platform called Neighbors. Neighbors is a hyperlocal platform that connects people who are in the same geography. There are similar platforms that are out there. Citizen is one of them in the US. Another one is called Nextdoor, but it's basically a hyperlocal platform where people can talk about the neighborhood. And you would think that in the neighborhood, when I come to you, my next door neighbor, and I talk to you about the beautiful flowers here and there that are happening, that would be replicated on the internet. No. When you have a camera that stares at your doorstep forever, every time, 24/7, and every time someone walks by, it notifies you. You get this idea of constant paranoia. And how that translates is that a lot of people post online and are like, there's a person who's not supposed to be here at my doorstep. And that, unfortunately, is a lot of human bias. It starts becoming a platform where someone gets to determine who belongs in a neighborhood and who doesn't. And so on this platform, Neighbors, a lot of people who are more affluent and oftentimes also more white in the US will post about Latino folks, will post about Black folks, and will post about homeless people and say, this person should not belong here. And here's the fun part about trying to make money of platforms, which was the theme, the YouTube talk we had. A lot of this data gets sold to police or gets sent to police departments across the country. In the US, 2,600 police departments have a partnership with neighbors. And that means that any given police officer who is part of a police department gets an automated feed to these notifications. And so we found one police officer, for example, who had 10,000 emails from neighbors over the course of 1.6 years, right? So imagine 54 emails in one day. There's a man on my doorstep. There's a package being stolen. There's someone who's suspicious in the neighborhood. And a lot of the footage that accompanies that is often racially coded. And that is bias slowly seeping into the consciousness of a police officer, slowly seeping into the consciousness of a person who's supposed to enforce the law. How does that signal who gets to be policed and who does not? And that was the story that we did. We received, the way in which we looked into that was that we noticed that there were emails being sent to police. Again, a crime gets posted on these platforms, bam, an email lands in, let's say, 11 to 50, 60 police officers' inboxes, right? And so we were like, you know what? That's subject to the Freedom of Information Act in the US. Let me and my students come together and we're gonna send a Freedom of Information request, a public records request to 25 different police departments across the country that have these partnerships. And the LAPD gave us about 202,000 emails that allowed us to extract that information and then start to classify how many of these alerts are actually about crime and how many of them express something suspicious in the neighborhood. How many of them express potential bias versus how many of them show us petty crime. And what we also found was that the people who posted the most experienced not more crime, likely less crime. And the people who then deserved the ear of the police were also the more affluent, oftentimes whiter neighborhoods in the US. And we all know, and we've seen, George Floyd had a ripple effect around the world, right? We've all seen what bias is built into policing. And the bias that is built into the data, how to afford it to people. That is something that I always find really difficult. People consider data to be statistics that are completely neutral. But no, data are a time capsule that encapsulates everything that society valued at that point in time. Some data is an interview done thousands of times by a government institution and what they considered as important at the time. Other data, for example, on YouTube, sorry, whoever he is, as well as other platforms, is data collected to create more viral information. Every single post has a particular set of data associated with them, right? You have, on Facebook, you have haha, wow, hug, what is sad, angry, right? These are emotions in the extreme. And so this is the data that is being used to then feed back information to you. But an article that solicits nuance, that makes you wonder about, I don't know, the state of life and makes you actually grow as a human being, that doesn't solicit a ha-ha or a wow or an angry or all of this stuff. And that information does not get surfaced. And so what we see is what I often call, imagine a funhouse mirror, a mirror that distorts. It's not lies that we see, it's not fake information, but what we see is a disproportionate importance being given to the information that is the most biased, that solicits the most emotions, and is hence maybe a grotesque and most sort of like extreme version of humanity. And I don't believe that that's a way in which we should understand society. That went very philosophical. Sorry.
Elan, você é uma especialista em ensinar jornalistas a ouvir isso que pode até ser chamado de a maior reunião de pauta do mundo, que são aquelas massas de dados que estão nas mídias sociais. E você tem um livro chamado Minerando Mídias Sociais, em que você se propõe nesse livro a falar para as pessoas que esse mundo não é tão intimidante quanto elas acham que é do ponto de vista técnico. Então, você no livro diz que análise de dados é uma mistura de arte e de ciência, e você pega as pessoas pela mão e vai ensinando a programar Python e programar não sei o quê, né, e fazer a pergunta correta nas redes. A minha pergunta ela é bem prática. O quão importante você acha que é hoje para o jornalista de dados e para o jornalista investigativo como um todo de ter alguma familiaridade com esse mundo e como que você se dedica a mostrar isso para as pessoas? E uma outra pergunta aqui embutida nessa, como é que começou a sua jornada nisso? Você parou e falou, eu preciso aprender isso aqui.
Okay. Two-part questions. I love this. I get to talk for a long time. So, number one, when it comes to data literacy, I think I want to introduce you to a wonderful term that I've learned in Silicon Valley, and it's called a bro grammar. You've probably heard of bros, dudes who are very important and like very smart and like strong, right? But a bro grammar is a term that I've learned about programmers who think that they're much smarter than you and walk around with this big bravado and this big ego and make you feel small. I think data and I think technology is full of programmers like that. And I think in many ways, there are a lot of people who intimidate everyday human beings when it comes to data and when it comes to data literacy. A lot of those folks will use jargon, will use words that are very specific to the technology to intimidate you. And I think in many ways, when it comes down to it, you can actually really trace back every single data point, right? One fun fact that you might want to think about is you can download all of your Facebook archives. So if you've been on Facebook for more than 12 years, which I have, oops, you can see every single post you put out there, every like that you've done, but you can also see every search you've looked at, and then you can start thinking, a data point is an action that I left behind on the internet. It's a digital footprint of my behavior. And then I can start thinking about the questions I want to ask of that data. I think doing what I like to refer to as a quantified selfie, understanding the ways in which your life is quantified by your digital footprint is one way of familiarizing yourself with a topic that might seem intimidating, especially because who is not interested in themselves, right? So in many ways, I think data literacy is really important when it comes to understanding what kind of stories you can tell. I think when we think about data, we think about the census, we think about surveys, we think about things that were static in time. But now you and I, as Thiago mentioned, by virtue of living and by virtue of using our gadgets, we leave behind about 5 gigabytes worth of data every single day. That was a statistic from 2013. Now multiply that by however many billions of people are on Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, all of these platforms. Every single person has left behind longitudinal behavioral data for themselves to look at. And that is one of the data troves that then these big platforms use to create different pictures of you, right? They are like, oh, you might like cooking videos based on your friends' data or your data, what I've seen you do on the internet and all of that stuff. All of us have received an ad that we were like, did you listen to my conversation? Is this why you want me to buy, I don't know, some makeup? And so I think there's a lot of ways in which data literacy and understanding how the web works, very fundamentally, very simple things can be done by, I don't know, taking 1 or 2 workshops. I come with a lifetime guarantee, so I can give you things afterwards. But I think in many ways, understanding how the plumbing of the internet works and how the data that we produce every day works is essential as a first step to then understanding how misinformation works, how algorithms work, how AI works. And I think that's really important. And so from a practical standpoint, you had data literacy. The second question was, how do I start?
Como é que você começou nisso? Quando é que você chegou e falou, eu vou aprender, eu vou entrar nesse mundo intimidante e vou descobrir o que tem dentro dessa selva?
Okay, so just to let you know the kind of person I am, I love ceramics. I love rock climbing. I love doing arts. When I was 13, the first thing I wrote was poems, not journalism, right? So I am not the kind of person who would love data or programming. And then I came to a job and they were like, we love that you did videos. make data visualizations. You did that for 6 weeks in college, go for it. I was like, wow. And so in many ways it was forced upon me. And I, in my little scarcity mindset, I'm an immigrant in the US and I had to always earn my place in the US. And so for me, it was like, okay, to keep my visa, I need to have all of these technological skills. I'm just gonna learn them while I can. And so I kind of taught myself. I taught myself first by counting individual rows, realizing that that was really bad, and then spending the night kind of figuring out how to do that. And then as you mentioned, it was actually about a breakup. I started teaching myself Python and coding by processing a really bad breakup and looking into the emotional recovery that I could find with the digital footprint that was left behind, right? I would look into how often I would post on Twitter or on Facebook after the breakup. I looked into all the text messages I received from my friends to better understand how much support I was having, right? I even quantified how much I was sleeping and made some data visualizations about that. Every project taught me a new skill. And I don't think that that's the biggest part. I don't think you come out of the woodworks and are like, I know how to code. But you can come and learn one step at a time. I started with spreadsheets. I started with very simple data visualizations. And then I was like, oh, I could scrape data. I could look into someone else's information. And then I started looking at other people's data. I don't know why, but many people have given me their password to their social media. If you want to do that, we can do that together. But it gave me a really great way of also building a relationship with the source. I could be like, tell me about your first year in New York through the music you listen to. Let me look at that and then plot that over time. Oh, there was a period where the song that makes you sad was all over. What happened? Oh, your boyfriend broke up with you? I'm sorry. Right? Like these are the fun ways. These are the very human ways in which you can really look into data. And I would say, I tell this to my students all the time, most people don't naturally really love coding. I definitely did not love coding, nor did I think that I was going to write a coding book. But I love figuring out how people tick, what makes them happy, what makes them sad, what happened to them. We as journalists have the license to ask the most intimate questions of strangers that we've just met. And now we have a digital archive that we can use to assist their memory better than what they might even remember, right? So that is like how I started teaching myself. And then from there, I noticed that I'm a woman of color in the US, and I am in a field where it's mostly white men who have grown up with wonderful computers and have a certain pedigree. They sometimes went to MIT, sometimes they went to Stanford, and I'm sitting here being like, oh, I learned this at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was crying and sobbing over my breakup, right? But the reason why I teach and the reason why I wrote the book was because too many people asked me the question you just asked. And so it's like, now it's free on the internet. You can learn on your own. And when you want to, you can come along and we can do a project together. And I think it models a different way of being in the tech space. It models a different version of journalism. I've heard that journalism here is also very competitive. You don't need to be like that. You don't have to have a scarcity mindset. You can do things in tandem. And if anything, if we're going up against something as gargantuan as AI, that might be completely polluting an already polluted media ecosystem, we need each other and we need to learn from each other. The skill set I have is very rare in journalism because if I wanted to, I could really apply myself and try to work at a place like Facebook or YouTube and make $230,000 a year. But I choose this because I think it's more ethical and because I think it is also more interesting. And because there's very few people who make that choice of making less money in an industry that's very stressful. I think that's why data journalists and a lot of technicians, technologists in the space of journalism have chosen to be more collaborative. And so yes, you start small, you start with spreadsheets, you teach yourself, but then you find your community.
Eu vou voltar aqui para uma outra reportagem da Lantuivô. Ela faz reportagens e é muito importante para ela, tanto os dados quanto a história, é que essas histórias tenham impacto em políticas públicas. E ela tem uma história sensacional, que aliás é uma série de reportagens sobre gentrificação em Nova York. Então ela vai pegar um quarteirão no Brooklyn e vai falar do impacto da gentrificação que acontece ali. a Lan costuma usar os dados que estão na internet para fazer suas reportagens. O que é interessante nessa reportagem é que a base de dados dela é diversificada. E aí tem uma coisa muito interessante. Em dado momento, a polícia não passa para ela dados atualizados. E o que acontece quando a gente vai contar uma história que nem tudo que a gente precisa para contá-la está na internet? O que um repórter faz? Lan, pode contar essa história, como surgiu a ideia de contá-la e quais os desafios que você enfrentou para contar essa história?
All right, I need a visual aid. Whoever has my slides, turn them on. I want to show you an old man. Here we go. So let's go further. There's many slides. We can go back to those in a bit. But let's see. This is neighbors. That's this misinformation on YouTube, whoever YouTube person is. So this is Ramon Hernandez. He is 105 years old. He was sitting on his stoop. He moved to the U.S. about 40 years ago in Harlem, which is a deeply Dominican place, neighborhood. And him and his neighbors have been playing dominoes for 30 years like that, right? And then all of us around the world, I've now spoken in South Africa, I've spoken all over Europe, I've spoken to people in different countries. Gentrification is a global phenomenon that has been happening. And oftentimes it means that richer people move into a neighborhood that used to be unattractive to them and that used to be populated largely with people who are maybe the marginalized community in that place. In the US, that's oftentimes people of color. And in this case, it was this young man, 105 years old, who sat on the street corner in Harlem, which is very close to Columbia University and a lot of institutions that are slowly buying up real estate in those neighborhoods. And what happens in that neighborhood was that on one particular block where this young man lives, or old man lives, there were more than, I think it was 3,000 noise complaints over the course of 3 years. There was one day where there were 100 noise complaints. And the way in which a lot of technology has facilitated this type of complaint is that people can go on their app and be like, this person's too loud, file a complaint. This person's too loud, file another complaint. This person's too loud, file another complaint. And suddenly you have 3,000 on one block over the course of 3 years. If you normalize that, that's, I think, on average, I actually don't. I don't want to cite the wrong number, so I'm not going to do the math right now. But basically, this was disproportionate to what was happening on the ground. The data was anonymized, so we didn't even understand that this was actually coming from maybe 1, 2, or 3 people on that block. And that changed the ways in which this man had to live his life, because the police had to show up and enforce those noise, or enforce the law and say you can no longer play dominoes there. You can't be that loud. And I've learned now in my short time in Brazil that you like music and you like to dance and you like to party. Imagine you had your way of life on this block for 30, 40 years, and someone comes in and keeps on filing noise complaints. And because the data masks who that person is, you suddenly have to change the way you live, because 1 or 2 more affluent people came in and wanted to change that. And so the ways in which we did this was the ways in which you measure, how do you measure people's discomfort with something? And there's a hotline that people in New York can call called 311. And when you call 311, you can be like, there's a pothole outside that needs fixing. Oh, there's a tree that fell over that needs fixing. But you can also call in a noise complaint. Noise complaints are one of the most ubiquitous data over there. We also looked into, and each noise complaint has what is called a latitude and a longitude, so almost like an X on on the planet. You can go there and find it associated with it. And so we were able to find ways to correlate that with census data from on a small, almost block level data, where we were able to see how many calls to the police about noise were there per capita. And we found this outlier. And so when it comes to the methodology behind that, if you have data and you find an overall trend, you can then go into the data and find very specific outliers. You can find neighborhoods where that trend is particularly pronounced. And then because the data shows you that you're more likely to find something there, you might actually find something there. And that was the really interesting part. We found 1 or 2 neighborhoods where there was a disproportionately high rate of calls to police about noise. That sounds like the most boring paragraph I've ever told you, right? But then you go to the people and you're like, I found something in the data that might describe what you felt, what you've experienced. Can we talk about that? And then like, yeah, this one dude, he kept on calling the police. I don't know what happened. And so this was one of the men. He was like, I'm very sad. The police kept coming this summer and I had to stop playing dominoes and we had to stop playing music, even though that was the culture of that block. And I think technology has introduced a way for some of the most powerful people in society to voice their needs, have that go directly to police and government, and that bias to then impact people who aren't heard in that data. And so, yeah, that was the story.
Nessa história que a Lantuivô conta, tem uma parte que ela vai falar do impacto nos bares, no comércio, né? Essa região, ela passa a ser vendida pelo mercado imobiliário como um atrativo cultural, né? De música, dança. E essa mudança do perfil do bairro, a polícia também vai incomodar os bares. E em dado momento a Alan pede à polícia dados atualizados, eles não dão. Eu queria que você contasse a história da bicicleta, de como a Alan não se fia apenas com os dados que estão na internet. Ela foi de bar em bar, de porta em porta para contar essa história.
Right. So now we know data is full of biases, right? And just like, and if it's an interview done by someone else thousands of times, you want to be questioning that and be skeptical of that and analyze what's behind the data. And so the story you're talking about is how the very same noise complaints that bring about police have also been fed into an algorithm and into other metrics that then say, this might be a community hotspot for crime. If we take crime data overall and are like, we're going to look at how many calls to police were about this establishment, and this establishment, it bakes in a lot of the biases. And then suddenly, as you go through an algorithm, as you go through all kinds of math, it then classifies, let's say your establishment, because you seem to like to dance, as a high risk, high crime area. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to better understand what classifies a spot as a high crime hotspot. Well, you mentioned the bicycle. I took one sample neighborhood and I biked from one place to another, many of which have been closed because of the pandemic, but I noticed by doing research around them on using digital forensics, but also doing on-the-ground reporting, talking to people in the neighborhood, that the majority of the businesses that were flagged as being high crime in a gentrifying neighborhood were all black, right? Or serving largely black clientele. And that was really helpful for me to then say, you said you use data and technology, a very neutral way of determining something to enforce the law. But let me see, in your data, you already had bias, and then you used that someone in the headquarters, maybe it was a technologist, maybe it was the police chief, said, this is a data point we will use to make decisions about policing. And by virtue of using technology in the process, we are going to wash ourselves of all of our sins and say we are objective. But this is a very important thing to think about. In humanity, we have adopted a faith called technosolutionism. Technosolutionism is the faith, the blind belief that when we apply technology and science to something, it is objective and it brings us social progress. But technosolutionism has brought us a misinformation apocalypse that is now bringing about the craziest leaders in the world, right? Technosolutionism has brought risk assessments to social services. For example, one of my peers at fellowship, he did a story about an algorithm that looked into whether someone was deserving of welfare. And if a woman had recently lost a boyfriend or was out of a relationship and was a person of color, she was classified lower, right? And people were like, it's technology, it's data, it is foolproof. No, there's bias at every single stage. And I want to show that slide, if you could turn that on. I'm going to put my professor hat on because I think we need to talk about that before you hear more about technology.
Lá, enquanto você procura aí, gente, só avisando aqui rapidinho que o balcão de perguntas já está aberto. Quem quiser mandar perguntas, já podemos começar.
Here we go. So example story, we go back. This is an important concept that I'm just going to do as a professor because I can't help but teach all the time. I hope that's not patronizing. But this is hopefully an interesting way for you to understand AI. AI is nothing new. AI has been around everywhere. If you use Google, AI is in there. Autocomplete is AI. And what we see right now, the whole hype around ChatGPT, it's using the exact same technology that we use when we Google people, right? A good example that I often bring up is when you Google a celebrity, let's say Ryan Gosling from the Barbie movie, right? Whenever you Google Ryan Gosling, the next word is wife. Why is that? Thousands of women around the world have wanted to know whether Ryan Gosling has a wife. And that is data that was used by Google to then determine most likely the word after Ryan Gosling in a search should be wife, because maybe you're looking for a new husband. Anyhow, so important concepts. What I love about the hype, not much, but what I love about the hype around AI is that it's brought to you a way in which technology works. It has brought you literacy around technology that has already been deployed in your life, in your governments, in your law enforcement. And so here we see inputs and training data. That is the information that someone will take and then say, this is information that we want to use to predict some parts of the future, some ways in which language might be working, whether you deserve welfare or not, right? And then a model or an algorithm is nothing more than a few steps determined by a number of computer scientists who would then say, I'm going to take this data point and this data point and this data point and think about a way of scoring you, right, as someone who's more risky or less risky based on that data, right? And so the last part then is the output. Oftentimes you've seen the Pope in the bomber jacket. That is generative output. It looked at many pixels and then put together the Pope. Or you can have a score. This is most likely the Pope based on all of the data, right? Input, algorithm, output. As journalists, we can look at every single part and start investigating it. If you want to question AI or algorithms, you can be like, what is the data used for that AI? If you want to question the decision making that these companies have used to say something, then you can question the model or the algorithm. Or if you have nothing else, and this comes to your access question, you can look at the output. When I do investigative journalism around misinformation, I don't care about these two parts because half the time you don't get access to it. But I can show you how often misinformation surfaces in a particular community or around a particular subject, right? And one of the things that I want to show you before we move on is this chart. I recently saw this at a conference in South Africa. A scholar was showing us a chart that shows which data is being used to train a lot of technologies. We see a disproportionate amount of data coming from the US. Not very much from Latin America. Look at Africa. This reduces a lot of the outcomes and a lot of the imagination of AI, if you want to say so, right? To the imagination of one particular place. Disproportionate representation in the data from the US. There are a lot of stereotypes in AI, right? In the ways in which AI outputs anything from what an Indian person might look like, all the way to what it imagines women to be like or speak like. I think this hopefully helps you understand just how all of this works. Anyhow.
Acho que, Angélica, você tinha
You had a question. Maybe you had a question.
Pegando aqui o link, você tem esse esforço de injetar mais diversidade na maneira como o jornalismo é feito, né? Então a gente queria pedir para vocês mais detalhes sobre o Journalism of Color, sobre a sua iniciativa.
Right. So it actually started just with two friends of mine feeling like they were alone in the newsroom. I think you told me you were the first black reporter at Piauí 15 years ago, right? You were the only one, right? And so maybe, yes, there was probably maybe some burden on you to speak to all black issues. Or maybe there was a way in which maybe there was implicit bias of people not giving you all the platforms that you deserved or so. And you must have been really smart. Someone told me they went to college with him. He's very, very smart, right? To make it all the way to Piauí, a very prestigious magazine, right? And I think if you're the only one in the newsroom, there are challenges that you might have that other folks might not understand. And oftentimes it is the onus of the first one, the only one, to educate a lot, to then also rectify pay discrepancies, to make sure that we all have an equitable process to do important work and so on. And so two of my friends, a black journalist, Aaron Williams, and an Asian woman, Julia B. Chan, they lived in the Bay Area and were like, we need a place where we can all talk with one another. And so they started a Slack community, and then that Slack community grew really quick. I think we're in our 9th year now. We have about 5,000 journalists of color from around the US who are all helping each other, right? And one of the things that we learned is that oftentimes some of the things, biases, human nature repeats in some ways. Biases are often the same, and so we would be like, okay, we found out that salary information is always important when we're trying to fight for equity. And so people would always start putting together spreadsheets and are like, how much do you make? How much do you make? Where do you work? Okay, here's a study from a union. Let's put that into that folder as well. You're looking for a promotion? Let's give you all of that data in one go. And we kept on getting the same questions over and over again. And so based on the community, we started looking into the needs of journalists of color from around the, actually from the world. There's a lot of people from around the world in there too. And we started pulling together resources that we then put on a website for other folks to see. But this kind of work in terms of equity, it goes both into how we cover communities that are marginalized, as well as how we empower them once they're in the newsroom. And I think there's been many amazing communities that are adjacent to that have cropped up. So right now I'm talking to a wonderful community called the Trans Journalists Association. They are just starting out. If you listen to Ben Smith later, his colleague Gina Schwa, she's actually spearheading a lot of those initiatives, bringing about resources to better cover and frame stories around trans people. I'm not sure how far the news has traveled, but in the US right now, the conservative base has made a lot of talk around race as well as gender into a big political fight, right? A lot of legislation. I think more than 500 laws have been introduced in different states that are directly impacting the lives of trans people and trans children in particular. And I think in this moment where we need to understand how to cover this issue, we also need to hear from the people who have experienced this, right? And so that is how we oftentimes now work together. It's a coalition that is very much about abundance of like help and care that then comes together and tries to tackle these things so that we don't have to do it all on our own in each newsroom.
Lan, para além da coisa que às vezes as empresas usam de forma publicitária, investimos em publicidade, por que você acredita que deve se investir em publicidade nas redações? Perdão, por que se deve investir em diversidade nas redações? Qual a importância disso?
I love that this question to us is probably very clear, but I love also always talking about it. Diversity is important because our world is becoming more diverse. You cut off access to different communities if you don't have people who actually have both the cultural competence and the linguistic competence to speak to different populations. And I don't think that like hiring one black person or one Asian person will solve that, but I do believe that having a multitude of voices that is approximately proportionate to the demographics of the society you're trying to cover can help you better access different stories and come to it with a more holistic understanding, right? I think in many ways, the ways in which, for example, certain folks will, let's say you probably have a lot more access to black folks in a way that maybe I don't as a reporter. That doesn't mean that precludes me from reporting on that, but for me, I think having you to talk about this and maybe then also figuring out different ways of covering the communities I'm not part of, all of that is part of the newsroom culture that can then elevate your reporting, make it more nuanced, and avoid stereotypes and avoid things that are potentially harmful to a community. And in this particular environment where there's already a trust deficit between the audience and news, right? We need to ensure that we do own up and try and work and do our best to come to a community with a humility that we need to then research the stories that affect them the most.
Angélica?
I don't know where to look.
Lana, você também tem falado muito sobre os aspectos éticos do uso dessa massa de dados disponível aí no mundo sobre cada ser humano, né? E quando esses dados são usados como políticas de governo para excluir populações marginalizadas ali. E tem algumas reportagens interessantes saindo no mundo sobre isso, né? Você podia falar mais um pouco da sua visão sobre esse tema específico para a gente?
So ethical implications of data. Right?
Sim, sim.
So there are two things that are interesting in that realm. There's the idea of privacy, right? If I post something onto my Instagram, which is private, and tag my mother, it is one expectation of privacy. If someone takes that data point and does something else with that, even if it were, let's say, semi-public, it would change the privacy relationship that I have with that post. Privacy is always relational, right? I don't want the government to see my work, but maybe that is one way in which we need to consider and look at what is called data stewardship. What happens to data once we post it? What happens to all the information that we put there that then gets used by someone else to make a decision? And oftentimes it also gets misinterpreted. One of the things that I've heard a lot is that in the US, some of the police departments will look at social media of teens, people who are in maybe early teens, 13, 14, 15, who are suspected gang members, right? And we all know kids are kind of, goofy and like to talk a big game, but not necessarily always follow up on that. And so a lot of police departments now look at pictures that kids post and they sound like they're being really mean and so on and start making judgments on that. But they don't know the context. They don't know the social milieu. They don't understand the language and the slang and the cultural contracts that people have with each other, even in that virtual community, right? And so there's a lot of misinterpretation that has landed teenagers in gang databases that are now criminalized for being, let's face it, we're all stupid on the internet sometimes, right? And so there's an interesting way in which data stewardship, right, when we take it from one place and put it into another without much communication about that happening, changes the ways in which that data is interpreted and changes the context within which we understand the data. So that is one of the ethical things that I find important. So that's the privacy aspect. And then when it comes to making decisions, one of the things I think about deeply and a lot is the idea of missing data sets. Just because one engineer decided to say that he will only collect information about what we like, what we haha and wowed and emotional things, what we comment on, what we post, that is a very skewed and very particular way of looking at a person. And I think what's also happening a lot is that marginalized people often only exist in what I call punitive data sets. Most people, let's say undocumented immigrants in the US, they don't want to be seen. And the only data that oftentimes is used about them and used to identify them is data that identifies them as undocumented and might show brushes with the law. Maybe they had criminal data. Let's say they had a driving ticket or something like that. That is punitive data. Or brushes with child services, right? Like there's a lot of ways in which there are certain people who only exist and are captured in data that is punitive or don't exist at all, right? I think about this a lot. My grandmother was a maid on a colonial plantation. I once was really interested in seeing what her life might have been like. And she had horrible experiences in that job. And I really wanted to understand the larger context. And I know that the colonial lord was not very kind to her. The only documentation, the only written accounts that came close to detailing what her life was like was a magazine called Tropique, which was about, or Tropics, I guess, which described the colonial lord as a wonderful woman, kind of like a Joan of Arc of colonial lords that her servants really loved. What does it tell you about the existence and the oral documentation I have received about her experience versus what is officially documented. And that exists in many ways, right? The first document of enslaved people in the US was one of runaway slaves. One of the first documents of enslaved people in the US, of black folks in the US, was that of runaway slaves who were then described as a property. That is a gaze that you choose to look at people with, you know? And I think that vantage point is important. For a company like YouTube, we are data points that help them monetize. There was a lot of talk about monetization, right? And they share some of the monetization to 140,000 people, but 140,000 people in a city alone, like Sao Paulo, where there's 22 million people, what is that, right? And then there are other people who are keeping tabs on folks, right? What are they doing? How can I find information about maybe figuring out whether they're committing a crime, or when it's students, whether they're posting something bad and so on. We have this massive surveillance technology now that is looking at people from a vantage point of trying to catch them at something. And that is not how society should function. That is a very limited and skewed way of looking at people.
Lan, no início do ano, grupo de executivos, pesquisadores da área de tecnologia assinaram uma carta dizendo que a inteligência artificial, como o ChatGPT, poderia representar um risco para a humanidade, né? É uma mensagem bem alarmista. Eu queria perguntar se aqui no Brasil o Estadão, por exemplo, já usa, né? Não se pode produzir textos a partir do ChatGPT, mas você pode fazer pesquisa. Você acha que é possível usar no jornalismo de forma positiva a inteligência artificial? Você concorda com esse alarmismo? Qual é a sua perspectiva?
AI is like any other technology, is a double-edged sword. It's a tool. You can do good with it and you can do bad things with it, right? And I think one of the ways in which I think about AI is to think about the possibilities of taking a manual human task and maybe speeding it up, right? I think the way in which AI is now known in the common thought processes is the large language models, which can sound like a person and find you really interesting information about, let's say, I made my itinerary about coming to Sao Paulo with ChatGPT. All of these things are doable with that, but it does not necessarily do the job or know the difference between fact or fiction. AI mimics. If you think about some of the scholars who've written about it, they call AI, which is basically a bunch of math, right? Using data, math, output. They call AI parrots because they mimic and parrot human language. They mimic and parrot some of the things that are baked into the language that they see, right? And so I think to some degree using it needs to be done. I like to say that if you want to use AI, use it, you have to babysit it. You have to make sure that it doesn't do anything wrong, that it doesn't lie, but it can be a gap stop. So let's say, I think Marina, who's going to talk later today, she's going to talk about how they use machine learning, which is a version of AI, to classify and analyze and get a quick overview of information that was in a massive trove of data. But you still need to evaluate. You still need to know what questions to ask. You still need to go back and see, so what human actions led to this particular digital trace, right? And so I think just like any other technology, it's a double-edged sword. You can use it one way or another.
Agora, eu queria só puxar mais um pouquinho por essa pergunta para o aspecto mais prático das redações. Porque nos últimos meses, veículos do mundo inteiro estão começando a lançar os seus manuais de boas práticas para redação de uso de inteligência artificial ali, né? Uhum. Então, quando que você deve avisar para o leitor que você usou, no que é aceitável ou não. O que você acha que é aceitável, o que dá para fazer? Se você fosse lançar o seu manual próprio aqui para a gente, quais seriam os seus itens?
Again, unfortunately, I'm not like Ben Smith, who is going to speak later today. He somehow seems to find $10 million every few years to start a new news organization. Not me, but if I had a few thoughts on that. I recently learned about an initiative at the London School of Economics that all of you should check out that looks into uses of AI in newsrooms. And I think when it comes to AI, because we have, I don't think the majority of people know exactly how it works, but I think now there's a general knowledge of it being a little difficult, maybe lies sometimes, is something that we should be cautious about. And that comes back to trust. If we use it and don't tell folks, right? and it creates some kerfuffle or problems or accidentally hallucinates, then we create an incident that mars and harms our trust with our audiences. And so one of the most proactive ways in which I think some folks are looking into it is they look into what AI exists, what its capabilities are, what its flaws are, and then build a policy around how it might be useful for the newsrooms and how to communicate that with the public. What is your policy on AI? And how are you using it? And how are you not letting it just write articles for you on the internet, right? Sports Illustrated recently, there was a story about how I think a partner that they worked with used AI to produce stories and made up a fake journalist who was writing about AI, writing about sports. That is not something you want to be doing. But if you want to use it as a gap stop, let's say you receive a leak of millions of emails and you want to get a better feel for understanding which person shows up the most there. You can use some machine learning or maybe even some AI tools. I know some lawyers are doing that now. They take documents and find ways of summarizing them to then say, hi, in this process, here's our methodology. Here's how we analyze the data. Here's how we went back and double checked the data. That way you, as a reader, can make your own decision on how we used it, whether it was responsible enough or not. And I think one of the best things that I learned from being at BuzzFeed News was that when I was working there, they would publish the raw documents alongside the story. And as a data reporter, I oftentimes publish the raw data, how I did my analysis. And if you, who has started learning Python with my book, I'm told, want to do my analysis, you can then download the data and reproduce it. That is part of the whole, the industry of data journalism now. We show what we've done as a way of creating trust and as a way of spreading that knowledge to other people.
Tem uma plataforma, um site chamado Reddit, que os jovens adolescentes usam muito para discutir coisas, né? E no 9º capítulo do livro da Lan, ela fala como encontrar tendência de dados no Reddit. É um lugar que eu sempre achei assim um tanto tóxico, né? Onde há disseminação de fake news. Eu acho muito interessante, isso está no livro da Lan, encontrar respostas nesse lugar, porque são lugares que a gente tenta evitar, né? O Facebook tem muita fake news, eu não quero entrar lá, aquilo não me interessa. Eu quero perguntar para a Lan qual a importância dos jornalistas estarem atentos para esses espaços e que tipo de pautas podem sair dali. Você citou no seu livro o caso da vacina, né? Ela entra no Reddit, ver subgrupos de discussão para ver o que todo mundo acha da vacina. Queria que você desse exemplo e a importância de estar nesses espaços de disseminação de fake news para combatê-las.
First of all, congratulations to him. He made it to chapter 9 of my Thank you. But people are reading. It's a coding book. It's not easy reading. I think one of the ways in which I think about these platforms oftentimes that we avoid because sometimes what we read hurts us, right? Sometimes as a woman, when you read something that is really sexist and like puts down women, we avoid those places. Sometimes when we look into racist terminology on these platforms, we avoid them. But what's interesting to me is to better understand how they all kind of fit into how we see the world. Nowadays, we perceive reality through what is called a filter bubble. Everything is filtered towards our proclivities, our preferences, our past history of what we interacted with and not. So what we see is very, very particular to our past behavior and what Google and Instagram and all of these other platforms think of us. But what we need to understand is that these very, very personalized bubbles now have become a very, very like divisive force in our society. And so when it comes to Reddit, one of the things that I learned by working with a great scholar, Joan Donovan at Harvard, she talked a lot about how there's a lot of people who will come together in forums like Reddit, right? And scheme. And then they're like, we are going to manipulate media and we're going to manipulate attention and start talking about, let's say, how Hillary Clinton's emails were really, really bad, and we need to not vote for her. So they start convening in smaller spaces. And now in different countries, right, different platforms matter. This also happens on Telegram. This happens on WhatsApp groups. This happens on, what's the gaming platform? There's different platforms where people basically speak to each other, come together, forge a plan to then manipulate media. They come to a bigger, more mainstream platform and start spreading things and start seeing, oh, this is getting attention. Let me come in and give it more attention in a concerted effort to make it to go viral. And then that might get picked up when they are very successful by big media organizations, by television programs and all of that, that then spreads it even more generally. And so I think what we see is that the niche places have become places that we have to reckon with and that we have to see and better understand to understand how they're impacting politics now, how they're impacting society, and how we think about things, right? Too often have we let rotten, let's say, discourse sit in a corner and then, let's say, radicalize one or two people. In the US, that leads to shootings at schools, that leads to mass shootings. In other places, that might lead to radicalization of a US representative. In other, it has become so large that the small bad discourse that happens in these niche platforms is impacting mainstream politics. Yes.
Lan, você é professora, queria que você ajudasse a gente. Tem muitos jovens jornalistas, estudantes aqui. Como usar as redes sociais, o Reddit, por exemplo, para achar uma história, criar uma pauta? É o passo a passo, assim, que tipo de história a gente pode achar ali? Como usar esses espaços para criar uma história, para achar uma história?
Can I have my slides back? Sorry. Here we go. Not yet. Almost there. Here we go. So here we go. This is there's so many stories that we can do. So this is an example of online, of a story that we did about a woman who was being trolled by the far right. Her name is Doris Trone. She was mistaken, she's an Asian woman, apparently all Asians look the same, for this woman, right? Taking pictures of something, and then the internet came for her. And they were like, let us troll her and take her down. And we wanted to do a story about what it looks like to be trolled by, in a new era. This was at the beginning of the Trump administration. And we looked into how often she was mentioned over time, right? Like the day that the trolling started, how many times she was mentioned, and then how it subsided over time. And I think this is an experience that we wanted to show people. What is the emotional toll? What does it feel like to be trolled? And that's what we visualize as well. We show just how it's a barrage of trolling that happens. And what we did was a simple way. At the time, Elon Musk was not in charge of X. We were able to get, I think it was 24,000 tweets to chronicle exactly how that happens. And I think when it comes to stories, it still is about what is happening to that human being. You can start thinking about recreating a timeline. So one of the most interesting things that has happened in migration around the world is that nowadays people use a phone to get from A to B. I know when I covered the migrant crisis in Europe in 2015, a lot of migrants would come from Afghanistan, walk through many different states and use their phone at every given point to figure out how to get from A to B. And oftentimes their journey was chronicled on WhatsApp. Guess what? You can download every chat on WhatsApp as a CSV and start looking for words. You can start looking into how it works. You can start looking into who they communicated with, who were the people who helped them through. Those are different ways of looking at it. And if you start thinking, again, of every person leaving behind about 5 gigabytes worth of data every single day that they use the device, again, this is old data from 2013, now it's more. You can start thinking, how can I reconstruct some of these things? Where can I look to find more information to then tell an interesting story?
Acho que a Angélica tem perguntas
Já
da
tem
plateia.
pergunta aqui chegando no
10
balcão.
minutes.
Tem uma aqui da Bruna Amorim. Você acredita que existe alguma forma de usar a inteligência artificial em questões de justiça social e jornalismo?
Bruna, was it? Yes.
Bruna Amorim.
Hi. Hi, Bruna. I don't know where you are.
Hello,
but,
Bruna.
Ela lá.
Hi. So I think there are ways in which you can start looking for patterns, right? Like I do a lot of stories that look into immigration, that look into race and ethnicity, sexism, trans folks, all of the sad things that end up getting you trolled on the internet. And I think there's a way in which you can look into anything from the policies that are passed and what kind of language they're using, right? To showcase that a lot of US representatives are working with one another to pass basically the same language around trans legislation and trying to create what now is often dubbed as a culture war in the US, right? It just depends on the story, but you can also look into anything where you could, let's say, there's a rise of the far right in the US, where you could look into how are people talking about race and ethnicity, and you could start looking into how is there rise in racism through the language that you might be analyzing if you get access to a massive data trove of a conversation that might be happening. I think how does a misinformation story travel, right? Like you can start looking into, if there's a long chat history, you can start looking into who is pushing it on a particular chat and how are they pushing it and what kind of words are they using to push that particular narrative. That is a way in which you can use some of the AI and data journalism. But don't forget that AI is just a fancy word for taking data, using a model to analyze it, and spitting out a result.
Tem
Other
mais uma,
question?
Jé?
Tem uma outra aqui que eu fui instruída para passar diretamente
It's a long
para
question. Okay.
você.
Ah, pra você,
Para
pra
ela,
você.
para
ler.
ela aqui,
For
né?
your read.
Oh, okay. Okay, I will try to do a dramatic reading of this. For me, it is clear that the turn out of LLM approach for advancement of AI as unsupervised training can come from the fact that those creating this technology are white privileged Americans who would imagine the internet is a fair representation of the world. That's a very good point. Like you try to empower racialized journalists. Shouldn't we being empowered? I think I can't read the rest of this, but I think what you're talking about is that we often think that the internet is a clear representation of society, right? That every person on the internet is also representing every single person who's out there. I would like to posit that the majority of the internet users are probably what I call a lurker. You just kind of watch, and that there is a loud minority that is being heard over and over again, right? Who here has been bullied off the internet? It's usually a lot of women, it's usually a lot of people of color, it's usually about a lot of queer folks, right? And so I think oftentimes what we forget is that we don't understand the imbalance of voices on these platforms and who is favored to speak, who is favored to be listened to, and who ends up being baked into that particular AI. But yes, I think that was a comment, not the question. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. Right. Right. So to go back to my boss, if you can get $10 million for technologists of color, I would love that. To your point, I think there are some folks, so I was, as I mentioned earlier, at an African investigative journalism conference. There was an incredible person there. He's a data scientist who realized that the majority of content that was being trained on, right, like the majority of data was in English, even if it was pertaining to South Africa. And 90% of South Africa, from what I understand, is black. And a lot of those folks don't speak English. They speak at home. They speak Zulu and Xhosa and all of these other languages. And what he's done is to create data sets that can be used to train an algorithm in Zulu, in Xhosa, and all of these other languages that are usually overlooked. And yeah, I do think that those folks should be empowered. The sad reality right now is that people like Sam Altman get all of the attention and hence the billions of dollars, but people like this young man in South Africa do not. And he has been doing this community-based grassroots effort where he works with people who do journalism in Zulu, people who write in Zulu, even the Jehovah Witnesses have translated more text into Zulu and digitized it than many other institutions in South Africa. And so he's working with those folks to at least put out some other data that people can use. And not only is he making that, he's putting it out for free for people to use. And so there are technologists that have been starting to do that kind of work. Another person who I really love is Joy Bolomwini. She has a doctorate from MIT, if I'm not mistaken. She found out that algorithms and AI that was doing facial recognition could not see her because she was dark-skinned and black until she put on a white mask. And so she has been putting together a league, I think it's the Algorithmic Justice League. You should check them out. That has been getting some funding, and we should definitely support them more. And I think this is one of the reason why I'm on a soapbox and I'm like, learn data, is because I do believe that by empowering more people, we can raise the level of technology being produced for the world to use. But yes. I know. Yes. Right. Yes. And so let's knock on those doors. It is absurd.
Estamos na reta final aqui.
Sim,
Tá, não. Desculpa.
Bom, pessoal, estamos chegando no final aqui. Tem alguma derradeira aí?
Eu tenho pedir dicas para a Lan. Lan, se você pudesse dizer para todos nós aqui que gostaríamos de nos iniciarmos na pesquisa de análise de dados, você pode dizer pelo menos 3 plataformas ou ferramentas que sejam fáceis para a gente começar a trabalhar e analisar dados?
Okay. Excel. It sounds like, no, it's not. Everything, Excel is like wonderful. Oh, sorry. This is it's the best. It's sort of like a very good starter tool. It's a starter kit to learning how to do analyses. Because everything that you do in Excel, you can then do on a bigger scale. The only reason why people are like, Excel is not enough is because it crashes after it has like 65,000 rows of data or something like that. But every process, the intellectual and editorial process that I do in a lot of these investigations starts with the exact same things that I can do in Excel. What is the biggest number and what is the smallest? What is the median? What is the average? How does the median compare to this particular group? What is a trend or anomaly? All of these things you can actually answer with Excel. So that's number 1, right? You need 3? Okay, let me try. I think the biggest thing that I think is not even, like, find a data set that relates to something that you care about. That can be the Census Bureau, that can also be data that you download about yourself. Because one thing I've noticed about teaching a lot of students, from high schoolers all the way to older journalists who definitely don't want to learn from me, right? Like, is that unless it's applicable to you, you don't want to learn these tools. And so I would say, if you want to, let's say you're a culture journalist, right? Film journalist, there's a great database about Netflix, for example. Where a Netflix movie was released, how, when it was released, all of that stuff, what the director was, and so on. You could use that to find answers to questions that you might have had. Or you can download your own data and better understand how your behavior might have been over the course of time. And then the third one,
1 minute.
I'm sorry?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. You can ask me about that afterwards. But I do think that in many ways it is about stubbornness and finding yourself a community. So there are a few Slack communities. One is called News Nerdery, that where you can talk a lot about data. And then our Journalists of Color Slack is journalistofcolor.us. We have a small data channel. It is about finding a community that can help you, and that can also be gentle enough to introduce you to something that seems very alienating. And I got 30 seconds. Okay.
Gente, é isso.
Muito
o trabalho
obrigado,
da Lan
gente.
tem tanta interface que a gente poderia ficar 48 horas aqui, né? Mas obrigada.
Thank you.